what I'm going to do is to just raise some issues and hopefully to give you an exercise as a conversation starter for our discussion. And I don't particularly like the titles "How To," not because I'm not a practical person. I hope I am, but I know that how-to titles can be simplistic in their methodology and approach. But I would wrestle with the question, always bearing in mind the practical implications or the practical use of what I'm trying to say. And I also have to highlight the irony between the two presentations, that the one that we already had before mine and my own. We have had a presentation coming from a majority evangelical context, talking about lessons to learn from that context. I come from a very different context, talking about evangelical theology from the margins, from the periphery. I guess that the last Italian evangelical theologian who had a significant impact was an exile, and Peter Martyr Vermigli in the 16th century. He had to flee the country, and he developed his theology in Zurich, Strasbourg, Oxford, and then back in Zurich where he died. And perhaps the next theologian that comes to mind is Francis Turretin in 17th century Geneva, again an exile, and not even having been able to see the family town where the family came from, Lucca, but a Genevan exile. And so for me to talk about this huge topic is a bit ironic, but I accept the irony. And but I want you to realize that as they say it now in academic studies, my positionality. And another bit of positionality business. We're talking about academic theology, and I guess I am a bit of an academic theologian, but not in the full sense of the word. And that also is explainable in terms of my context. There are no academic theologians in my region, in my context. Although I think I qualify in a way, in a sense, to a certain extent, because part of my work is academic and both institutionally and scholarly. But my take in academic theology would not, qualify as a professional academic theologian, but more as a practitioner, entering and crossing over the line of academic theology in several ways. So, what I'm trying to do today is to offer, first of all, a very superficial but introductory bird's eye view of 20th century and 21st century evangelical approaches to the academy or the academic world, and I take as for a initial narrative this threefold type of typology, whereby the 20th century has been largely characterized by the combination of the three different ways in which evangelical theology has approached the academy, or vice versa, the academy has seen evangelical theology. There is the first strand characterized by controversy and conflict and separation that has instilled in evangelical theology a contra academiam type of approach. evangelical theology found its place outside of the academy and against the academy. And we can see it epitomized in the, for example, the 1923 book Christianity and Liberalism. Following the fundamentalist modernist controversy, one of the ripple effects of that controversy was the parting of ways of academic theology and evangelical theology, to the point that, as far as Gresham Machen's was concerned, there were not only two institutionally separate worlds, but actually two theologically diverse and separate worlds. And that controversialist legacy has been impactful in all kinds of ways throughout the 20th century. We also have the evangelical resurgence aspiration to regain a foot into the academy and to try to build bridges in order to be readmitted into the academy. Once expelled, trying to come back and to reestablish a presence in the academy. And I take as an example of this strand the foundation of, for example, the Evangelical Theological Society in 1949, Tyndale House in 1956, and the 60s and 70s have been all decades where we can see this trend emerging not only in Europe or the US, but all over the places in the world. 1969, the constitution of the Fraternity of Evangelical Theologians in Latin America, beginning to build institutions aimed at encouraging evangelical engagement in scholarly and the academy and in scholarly theology. The Fellowship of European Evangelical Theologians, FEET, in 1976, encouraged by John Stott, Klaas Runia, and others, aspiring at the same results, and many other institutions that, after the Lausanne Congress, emerged as a way to encourage evangelical engagement in the academy. And then the risk of assimilation. In a way, that aspiration was in many ways successful and productive, to the point that by the end of the century, people began to ask whether or not something had been lost along the way. And I take as an example David Wells's book, No Place for Truth. Whatever happened to evangelical theology? This desire to be accepted, this desire to be conformed, this desire to be part of the big table, the good conversations led evangelical theology to a season of crisis. What is evangelical theology? Now that we have regained a foot into the academy, have we lost our identity, our soul? And so the question, whatever happened to evangelical theology, is a red flag in this respect. And so there are, we could figure out, according to our context, according to our specific situation, the combination of the three strands, all somehow being intertwined, occasionally one strand becoming more prominent, occasionally another strand becoming more prominent. Against the background of that very sketchy typology, what are the critical and moving dimensions of present-day evangelical theology? What are the critical issues that we face as far as evangelical theology is concerned, with special reference to the academy? And again, this is my take, coming from the periphery, coming from the margins, and as a generalist theologian, trying to map out what is at stake in my own world, in my own camp, and trying to see what is going on when it comes to identifying, defining the meaning of what is evangelical theology. And first of all, I see one of the critical dimensions as related to the very meaning and reception of the word evangelical, not so much in terms of its content or significance, but in terms of the choice between it being an adjective or a term, a substantive. Is evangelical theology in the expression referable to an adjectival use, or a more substantial use? Is it evangelical theology? Is evangelical in evangelical theology an adjective, or is evangelical theology a complete expression? Is evangelical only a qualifier of something else, or is it evangelical the term that qualifies something else? The scriptural principle, the viability of Scripture alone in the attempt at doing evangelical theology in the academy. What does it mean in today's theological practice to be committed to the scriptural principle? The historical Orthodox heritage, to what extent evangelical theology reflects this trajectory, historical trajectory, going back to not only the Bible, but going back claiming some kind of sense of belonging to the great tradition. To what extent evangelical theology is a modern development of theology or a version of an ancient historical trajectory. That specific location of evangelical theology across the historical spectrum is something that is moving and is not fixed. What is the Protestant heart of evangelical theology, if there is such a heart at the very center of the evangelical theological enterprise? Is it the Protestant heart vis-a-vis Rome, that the fact that it originated or it found an expression in confronting itself, in confrontation with Rome? Is it still something of a defining element of what evangelical theology is in the context of the academy? Or have we lost that heart in order to transform or change the meaning of evangelicals as something not particularly and necessarily related to that Protestant heart? What is the socio-political public stance, given the fact that when we talk about evangelical theology, we're also dealing with the public dimension and the public square, and how evangelical theology pursues its calling to be to serve the reflection of evangelical churches, evangelical faith, evangelical movements in the public square, and seeing, as we have heard in the previous presentation, the complexity of that spectrum and the complexity of polarizing or pitting conservative accounts over against progressive accounts, and the whole issue that we have just heard from in the previous presentation. Another moving dimension of evangelical theology has to do with its own inter- or trans-confessional profile. To what extent we are diverse within evangelical theology, and to what extent there are boundaries around it in the sense of with regards in relationship with the even broader ecumenical setting of present-day academic theology. Are there internal boundaries? Are there external boundaries? This inter-collaborative, pluralist evangelical profile, does it translate into it being at the service of a even broader sense of evangelical theology belonging to the more Christian, ecumenical, trans-confessional, trans-traditional profile? Is there a place for evangelical theology in the context of a much broadly defined ecumenical theology? And then the global reality. We have listened to a presentation coming from the US. We are operating and living as evangelical theologians in Europe. But of course, we have to realize that when we talk about evangelical theology, we're talking about a discourse that is characterized by its globalization. And that means that although we still have important institutional centers in European evangelical theology and more broadly in Western evangelical theology, we have to come to terms with the reality of institutional polycentrism. There are multiple centers and multiple institutions promoting, doing kinds of evangelical theology all over the world. And also, one of the heritages of the 20th century is that evangelical theology has been influenced by its missiological profile. You know, the close connection between the development of evangelical theology and the development of missionary-minded networks and coalitions and institutions has caused evangelical theology to have this missiological shape. And also, at the very end of the 20th century, beginning of our century, the leadership vacuum. In many ways, evangelical theology in the 20th century has been characterized by the service of multiple men and women, multiple theologians working in multiple institutions, but on the whole, a community of people whom most of the participants in the theological discourse would know, at least as far as the names, the big names were concerned. Nowadays, it is difficult to identify leaders in the evangelical theological movement, especially if we compare the situation we're facing now with the situation we lived 20, 30, 40 years ago. At that time, the theological leaders were more clearly identified. In this generation, in our context, my perception from the margins is that if I look for leadership, it is more difficult to find them, to find leaders, to identify them. I don't mean that this is a negative aspect. It only means that it's what appears to me from my little place and point of observation, what is the reality out there. How do we know? I mean, if you think of the intertwining between the development of missionary initiatives like the Lausanne movement or other global networks that were clearly identified with leaders. And now we are approaching the fourth Lausanne Congress in September, and there is no global leader. There is no face. There is no identifiable, embodied, one single, if not even not two or three identifiable leaders. That is not necessarily a problem, but it's an issue that needs to be identified. Theological areas under pressure. And that's my perception. In the 20th century, the areas under pressure were primarily the areas of the prolegomena, the supernatural, natural supernatural, the scientific method having become scientistic method and negating the supernatural. And we had to we have to argue the case for biblical supernaturalism. Bibliology, the doctrine of Scripture, especially with regards to its origins and inspiration and divine claims attached to the Bible. The doctrine of the beginnings, protology, the whole issue of creation versus creation in the context of alternative or competitive accounts of the origins of the world. Eschatology, the whole area of the discussion surrounding the millennium or other eschatological accounts of the Christian faith. Hermeneutics, the interpretation of the Bible. Christology, especially with regards to the role and function of the uniqueness of Christ. And toward the end of the century, some ethical issues, especially making reference to bioethics, classical issues like abortion, euthanasia. And then also another area that needed theological work was the social impact of the gospel, emerging out of liberation theologies, transformational accounts of theology. All these things were, in the 20th century, part of the calling attached to evangelical theology. Now we live in another century, and while, of course, all of these issues are still alive and in need to be addressed and to be worked on, of course, there are more specific challenges that we are facing today that are not necessarily the old ones or the ways in which they were framed in the previous century, and they present unique challenges for theological work, even evangelical theological work. In the area of anthropology, as it relates to sex, gender, personal embodiment, the relationship between humanity and the non-human creation, that is something that was not part of the spectrum decades ago. The issue of theological pluralism that was also a part of the conversation of the 20th century, but today takes even an urgency that is even more acute. In the context of this global ecumenism, we are all one, we're all brothers, we're all, because of the challenges that we face in our world, the tendency is to think about Christianity as a whole, and so diluting differences. And there are positive aspects to it, of course. We talked about them, and we're here to support and to learn how to work together transconfessionally, transdenominationally. But there are bigger circles that claim the same type of collaborative effort. A theological accounts wanting to provide an even bigger platform and framework for a global, an even more globalized and ecumenically minded theological work. And so that's another area, theological pluralism and ecumenism. The doctrine of sin has come also under, has become a very important theological locus for our work, especially coming from an heritage that has tended to emphasize sin and its impact, its influence on the whole of the theological discourse, and having to do now with a tendency that tries to de-emphasize sin, tries to relocate it at the margin. I was reading an interview by the new president of the Pontifical Theological Academy. Sorry if I go back to my own area of expertise, but that's the kind of world that I live in. And he is Monsignor Stagliano. He's a theologian that the Pope called to chair the Pontifical Theological Academy that serves the Pope in his theological reflection. And he, being interviewed recently on the goals that he has in mind in his own work, he said, we need to de-amartheologize our theology. We need to lower the importance of sin. It has had so much importance that has become the central piece of our Christian account of things, and we have to relocate it as to follow our message of mercy and hope. Now, there are some parallels in what we have heard even in the previous session, and I think there is work to be done there, but the view there is to try to reduce or try to redefine or to provide a different account of the importance of this locus within the context of of Christian theology as such. Social ethics having to do with issues of justice and empowerment. And I also put into this category the work that needs to be done on the issue of prosperity, not necessarily related to the prosperity gospel, but the issue that is often asked and in our time related to wealth, distribution, equality, righteousness, and the role of the state, the church, and communities in bringing about prosperity. And then, as far as the eschatology is concerned, the topics are shifting away from 20th century, 19th century topics, eschatological topics, the millennium, the second coming, and are becoming more focused on the development of the digital world, artificial intelligence, and so on. And then, of course, public theology. We have also referred to several times in our network the importance of develop a properly done public theology. It has always been part of our task, but even more so today. We need to devote and dedicate work to this. Antidotes to evangelical theological shallowness. The task is really immense, and what are some things that we can at least consider in order not to fall into the temptation of compromise, shallowness, or following the faddish world of academic theology, allowing academic theology to set the agenda and having us evangelical theologians simply following after 10, 20, 30 years, and then realizing that academic theology, when we got there, has moved away. That has often happened, as far as my understanding of things. In the 20th century, academic theology set the agenda, evangelical theology resisted for a bit, then tried to ride the same horse, and when finally the horse got there, academic theology had moved away. And so we had to redo the work from scratch. The identity backbone. It seems to me that in order to do evangelical theology in our complex world, we need to work on our identity backbone and to nourish it and to affirm it and to assimilate it. And I simplify this point by making reference to the formal and the material principles of the Reformation. The formal, the commitment to the Bible. The material, the commitment to faith alone. And these are the two aspects of the backbone that we need to assimilate if we don't want to follow the trends of academic theology, running the risk of falling into the traps that we will find along the way. The apologetic perspective, always having an apologetic edge to our theology. Not all of us will be apologists in the professional sense, but without apologetics, without this apologetic edge, our evangelical theology runs the risk of becoming, of losing the backbone and losing the energy to interface, interact with different theological accounts and losing itself into the fruit salad of contemporary theology. Against idolatry in all forms, old and new, this apologetic task needs to be done properly with the right tone, the right attitude, the right posture, but it is inevitable if we don't want to lose the soul of evangelical theology. The principled flexibility factor. Yes, we have been trained in perceiving ourselves, evangelical theologians, as being part of a multicolor, multi-denominational family. And that is something that we should retain in order to avoid the risk of working in silos, be they denominational or be they related to our own traditions. And so putting our evangelical identity before denominational distinctives. And so doing evangelical theology as such, and of course not being possible to then sever ourselves from who we are, but first and foremost working towards developing an evangelical theology that speaks across the board of evangelical movements, churches, and institutions. The overcoming of the inferiority complex. That is especially true if you come from a place like my own, where evangelical identity has been shaped around this minority complex, oftentimes leading to an inferiority complex. And so the pushing people and theologians to show themselves and try to get a reputation in order to overcome that inferiority complex. Yes, we should strive for academic responsibility and respect rather than trying to chasing after the last fad. And so knowing that it is possible to be academically recognized without losing your identity backbone, your apologetic perspective, and your principled flexibility factor. That is an issue that needs our attention. And then finally, the institutional context. Theologians working on their own or just on their single institutions, that is going to be a danger for the flourishing of evangelical theology as a whole. So strengthening networks of evangelical theologians like the one we have here in Europe at the Forum, like other networks that are out there, being part of larger conversations, being part of networks of like-minded or evangelical theologians working as much as possible together to foster relational efforts and collaborative initiatives. That is all that I have to say. I don't think I solved the problem of how to stay solidly evangelical in the faddish world. That's why I remarked at the very beginning that I don't personally like the how-to type of titles, but I hope that this presentation at least was useful as far as a conversation starter. Thank you very much.